Good morning, everyone. I think it's still morning. Good morning, everyone. That's better. That's more Malaysian, okay? I follow the minister. How good is that? A few years ago, I was at a very large conference in New Orleans. Anyone been to New Orleans? Okay. A big conference in New Orleans. It's hard being an academic, you understand. And my paper was scheduled for the last day. So, in the morning, the minister was there, Parsi was there, Michael Fulham was there. It was a full audience. By the second day, the audience had dwindled. By the last day, my presentation, one person in the audience. Thank you for that wave of sympathy. So I said to this chap, I said, look, I could talk you through the main points of my paper. I said, but really, maybe we can just go for a drink or a cup of tea or something, 'cause that's very English. And he said, you know, I'd love to, but I can't, because I'm the after-dinner speaker. So there are, in fact, worse slots to have. Anyway, here I am. Thank you for inviting me, Bett Asia. Thank you for allowing me some time to talk with you. As you will notice, I am on my own. I should be with Dr. Michelle Jones, but unfortunately she's had a minor accident. Not too serious, nothing to do with the conference, of course, so she won't be with me today. However, you will also note that we have our Twitter handles there. So if you feel inclined to tweet, please do so, but please tweet nice things, okay? You can tweet anything you like about Michelle, but tweet nice things about me. I've been in Malaysia for 4.5 years. I came for 1 year. And people say to me, so why are you in Malaysia, Alma? What brings you here? And I normally say, well, it's because of the weather, or because of the food, which is fantastic. The real reason I'm in Malaysia is because I've come here to learn. I came here to learn. Now, I've learned a couple of things since being in Malaysia. The first thing I've learned is that English food is horrible. That's the first thing that I've learned. The second thing I've learned from being in Malaysia is I'm now a Malaysian driver. When I go back to England and I drive like a Malaysian, people find it startling. I do not stop at stop signs. I cut people up. And when they say to me, why are you driving like this? I say, because I'm a Malaysian driver, right? There's other things I've learned. I've learned about the education system. I've been into some fantastic schools in Malaysia, and I've learned a huge amount from being in the region. And many of us from different parts of the world. Sometimes you have to come to a different country to get a different vantage point on what you think you know, or in fact, you don't know. I'm going to start us with this. That's a photograph that I took with my iPhone. I'm walking through an airport somewhere in the world. I'm not going to tell you where just yet. It's not a brilliant photograph. I'll never win an award for it. But that is an airport somewhere in the world. So, unlike Parsi, I am not going to get you to sing. But I am going to get you to stand up. Can you all just stand up, please? With a degree of enthusiasm, even better. Everybody stand up. 2 people in the front, stand up. Thank you. Audience participation. Stretch those limbs and those minds. Now, what I'd like you to do in 1 minute's time is I'd like to get you to think about where in the world is this airport? It's somewhere. It's not a made-up photograph. I took it on my iPhone, but where in the world is it? Because in a sense, this is a metaphor for what I'm going to talk about. Sustainable change, and what we know or don't know about sustainable change. Okay, so this is what's going to happen. The people in the front rows, okay, you're going to just turn and talk to the people in the row behind you. The people in the back row, if you turn around, you'll be talking to the wall. So please don't turn around, but talk to the people in front of you. In other words, don't talk to the person sitting next to you. Talk to the person behind you or if to the side of you. It doesn't really matter. Anyway, Okay, here is the question. You have 1 minute to answer it through your conversation. Where in the world is this airport? Now, before you start, because this will be probably the most exciting thing you've done all day, all right? When I put my hand up like this, please stop talking, because this could go on for quite some time. And I've only got 25 minutes left. So, I will answer the question. Over to you. 1 minute, talk to someone else. Where is this in the world? Off you go. Okay, if I can just stop you there, and can you sit back down in your seats for the moment? There is a specific answer to the question, but I'm not going to give you the answer just yet. And there is, unfortunately, no prize for getting the right answer, but there is a right answer. I was asked to talk about change. And I guess anybody who sat through the presidential election results last week will know a thing or two about change, right? I don't think anybody, well, maybe some people could have predicted it, but I think it was surprising in all sorts of ways. Now, while I'm doing this particular input, I want you to think of a change that you are currently experiencing in your workplace, or that you want to secure in your workplace. What we know is change is a constant. It's how we deal with change. That's the most important thing. So while I'm talking, I'd like you to think of a change, something that either you want to introduce. If we think of the Malaysian blueprint, that's an enormous change. It's a huge document. How do we put that into practice? How do we implement that change? That's the real challenge. Parsi talked earlier about PISA. And I guess if Parsi was here, and he'd probably agree with me, PISA is just one benchmark. It's not the benchmark. So let's be clear that it's one measure, and that we have to take that measure as exactly what it is, one indicator of the performance of an education system. There are many others. For example, if we were to use well-being as an indicator, those countries might actually change position. So when we think about Malaysia, it's easy to say, you know, we could be doing better. Of course we could be doing better. But on other things, we're doing quite well. So my argument here is you have to see this in its entirety. The PISA results are important, but they should never be the be-all and end-all. That's what I personally believe. And while politicians might follow the PISA panic, which will undoubtedly ensue, we need to remember what is important. What is important in education? Is it PISA scores? Or is it the young person's experience in classrooms in Sarawak or Sabah? We need to think about Malaysia, and that's going to be my prime argument. We need to think about context here. I'm going to sort of talk for the remainder of my time about a study that we've done funded by the University of Malaya, where I'm currently working, looking at 7 different systems or subsystems. Because that's the other thing. It's easy to talk about Finland as a system or Singapore as a system, but Malaysia is one system, Australia one system, or several subsystems. So here are some countries that I've been looking at. Very different in terms of culture, in terms of performance, in terms of location, in terms of size. How many schools in Malaysia? 10,000. How many schools in Singapore? 375,400. Smaller system. So when we're trying to make sense of educational change and performance, we need to look at the context of those schools, the size of the system. Some things transfer, some things don't. They're very different systems. They're very different contexts. Some of them are high-performing in PISA. Some of them are less well-blessed in terms of their performance. Somebody's just switched me off on that screen anyway. So what are we learning? For the last 4 years, I've been collecting data from teachers, from parents, from students, from leaders in each of these systems. Now, I've been hugely privileged because I've sat in classrooms in each of these systems. And my argument is, you can't talk about educational change until you sit in the classrooms of these systems, because you don't know them until you sit in the classrooms. Am I right? You need to go into schools. You need to understand the context. So what are we learning? Well, there are some things that we are learning from this study that you may say, well, that's pretty self-evident. There are other things, I think, that have surprised us. Let me say a little bit about what we found. I like this quotation from Peter Senge, because I think this is my first big message, the first big finding. The change really, as we saw from the presidential election, is not a rational process. It's an emotional process. And what we're realizing is that if you're trying to bring about change in these different contexts, and think about your own context, whether it's higher education or it's a school or whether, it doesn't matter which sort of organization it is, if you believe that simply having a rational view of change will bring about that change, think again. We're realizing that organizations plan as if the change is rational, as if providing a plan can bring about the desired change. Think about that election. Big message, your version of change is not the only one. And therefore, communicating that change is important. So that's the first thing we're learning. The second thing we're learning is about scale. It is easy, oh so easy, to have a few schools in a project that are very successful and well-funded. But how do you scale that up? How do you move from the 10 to the 10,000? That's a more difficult proposition. And this is the challenge that systems like Indonesia and Russia and Malaysia face. How do you move from the few to the many? That's what we need to do if we're serious about implementing the blueprint and serious about bringing reform at scale. We have seen, and this is a warning, I think, we have seen lots of countries maybe looking to Finland. And there's nothing wrong with looking to Finland. And Pasi would be the first person to say this. Look to Finland and learn, but do not go to Finland and borrow. Because borrowing strategies that work in one context and one cultural location don't necessarily work in another. And I see so many politicians around the world making that same mistake. We'll just take the best of Finland or Singapore and we'll implant it in England or Wales or Scotland or any other country. Sometimes it works, more than often it does not. We need to recognize that scaling up from the few to the many sometimes is just simply not possible. It's an aspiration, but it just simply is not possible because of certain barriers and certain boundaries around the whole change process. And that's really what I'm going to be talking about. The third finding is around the process of implementation. We know that in order to make change a reality, it has to be deeply embedded in the system or the subsystem. So the process of implementation is really, really important. So the depth and the quality of implementation is much more important than the strategies that are selected. Now that seems counterintuitive, because surely you need good strategies, and you do. But if they're weakly implemented, you might as well have not had them in the first place. Most often, the process of implementation is an afterthought, or it's almost assumed to be just automatic, but it's not. In these systems that we've looked at, in the best performing systems, using PISA as the measure, what we've seen is they've got very, very good, robust, reliable implementation systems. They don't start an idea, it doesn't work, and then you move on. There's an excellent book by Charles Payne, and it's called So Much Reform, So Little Change. And I wanted to think about that. Every day we see so much reform, so little change. Why? Is it the wrong strategies? Could be. but more often it's to do with the implementation process, not being robust enough, not being able to deliver at depth. So there's a big message here about consistency. Patchy, inconsistent implementation will damage any well-intentioned reform. So if I was advising any minister or any government, it wouldn't be about the choice of strategies or initiatives or anything else. It would be about the quality and the depth of the implementation process so it reaches where it should reach into classrooms. So much reform just does not impact positively on learners. You get a policy churn where there's a lot of activity taking place, but nothing has changed substantially where it matters most in the classroom. What we know, and it was alluded to this morning by one of the other speakers, and that is that there is no, and I can say this categorically, and you can challenge me if you want to, there is no example of an organization that has turned itself around in a positive way without leadership being somewhere in the mix. Leadership is a driver of organizational performance. We know that. But the question is, if leadership matters, what sort of leadership do we need? And I'm not going to allude back to the USA example. I think that's the sort of form of leadership, quite frankly, that we don't need. What do we need? And if we look at the high-performing systems, and we look at high-performing schools, and we look at high-performing universities, yes, of course, the leadership of the person who's leading that organization matters hugely. But what matters more is whether there's quality leadership at all levels in the system. It's not down to the individual on top of the organization, guiding it and leading it. We found that it's leadership at all levels, right down to the classroom level, right down to the teacher level. The blueprint will only be meaningful if teachers engage with it, own it, and deliver it. We've also found that this is also an afterthought. Ask yourself the question, how often do we instigate a change without thinking, do we have the capacity to do this? Do we have the capability to do this? And if we don't, maybe we shouldn't start until we do have the capacity and the capability. So those high-performing systems that we see do have the capacity, do have the capability. And if they don't, they either buy it in, they borrow it, or they develop it. They don't just start and then hope against hope that they have the capacity and the ability to deliver that change. So there's something important here about capability and capacity. And in his work, Andy Hargreaves talks about professional capital, the technical know-how. Vicky Treadle talked about the social capital. Yes, you need that as well. But also you need the professional capital of those within schools and organizations to deliver those quality outcomes. You can't just assume that it's naturally there. This finding is a contradiction. Parsi said that in those weaker systems, we see competition rather than collaboration. True, but not totally true. Competition can be a driver for better performance. But what we've seen in our study is that the best systems, not only measured by PISA, but by other indicators, have a combination of both. In other words, they are collaborating in order to compete. Now, that seems a contradiction because we think competition on the one hand, collaboration on the other. But this social capital that is required to drive any change in any organization or any system is much more important than the individual capital. So the push of the many, if you like, is much more important than the pull of the individual. So that takes me back, I guess, to this conference. You know, we've got wonderful new technologies. Probably most of you are on your phones right now. I mean, most people would really rather lose their husband or wife than their phone, right? That's what I've experienced anyway. And it's just sort of a detachment anxiety that comes when you can't actually connect. I had that this morning, or you can't actually tweet, or you can't actually, Technology is wonderful, but it is only the medium. The message is important. But for many, communication is the change. What you hear, what you see. Think about the US. What you hear, what you see, what is advertised, what is promoted is the change. And new technologies can initiate and support positive change at scale. So we've got the technology at our hands, at our fingertips. You're holding your iPhone or any other sort of phone. Maybe you have two phones. I've never really understood why people have two phones, but some people have three. I don't really understand that either. I can just manage one. That's out of interest here. Let's be honest. How many people in this room have got more than one phone? See me later. I want to know why. I'd love to know why. Maybe they keep their private lives and personal life separate. We won't go there. All right, so this takes us back to where in the world? So this is audience participation, or I will randomly ask people to respond. Can you just tell me, I know it's a blurry photograph, I accept all that, but where in the world is this airport, do you think? I hear nothing. Singapore, Bangkok, Taipei, Malaysia.
International airport.
It is an international airport. You're absolutely right about that. But where in the world is this? Anywhere, correct. It's anywhere. So here's a thought. As we walk through our organizations and our schools of the future, think about Malaysia. As we walk through our schools of the future, do we want them to look like they could be anywhere? Do we want to say, well, we have schools in Finland that look exactly the same as a school in Singapore? Of course we don't. Oh, and by the way, this airport is actually in Bali. Are you surprised? 15 years ago, if you'd walked through that airport, it wouldn't have looked like that. Now, it looks like anywhere in the world. So here's the warning for me to you. As we start to create and shape different education systems, different schools, let's not take out what makes them special or different. Let's retain that special cultural difference that is so very, very important. So that's Bali. Oh, sorry, going backwards. So here's the final finding that we I guess, was more surprising than I thought, and in a way stands up against PISA and says, so what? And this is the finding that the cultural and contextual influences in our different organizations, our different systems, are rarely given the attribution for better performance. What do I mean by that? Well, often when we're trying to explain Singapore, Hong Kong, Finland, we talk about the strategies, we talk about the initiatives. We rarely take notice that there's something important about the historical legacy of those countries, the culture of those countries, that shapes and influences their education systems. So when we talk about performance, we can only talk about it in terms of the measure, but we leave out so much richness and heritage that comes from just simply being in that context. This is the other important point. We've also found that culture can work against you. Culture can work against you. So even the best and more well-intentioned change can lead to failure. Not because it's the wrong change, it's just that it doesn't fit with the cultural norms of that society. Okay, so as I'm concluding, there are three main dimensions, I think, and it's an interactive model of sustainable change. Quality, is it a high-quality strategy? How are you going to know? Look at the evidence. Please, please look at the evidence. So many policymakers choose a strategy without looking deeply at the evidential base about it. Secondly, building the capacity, which I've talked about, and thirdly, implementation. I don't have as wonderful a diagram as Parsi, but just look what happens if you miss out one of those steps. If you've got high capacity and high implementation, but low quality, you get the wrong change. Deeply embedded, but it's the wrong change. If you've got high quality and high implementation and low capacity, you haven't got the ability to deliver, you get shallow, superficial, or what I call cosmetic change. Nothing substantially has changed. The surface just looks different. And finally, if you've got high quality and high capacity, but low implementation processes, which I see so often, then ultimately you get unsustainable change. And you get that turbulence that I've talked about already. So here are the 8 findings, and I would suggest that you, if you want to, can take notes, which you're all doing. This is the new way of taking notes, I guess. These are the 8 things that are coming out of our study. And I think they're 8 quite sobering reflections on what we know about change and what we don't know about change. So shall I go back? Okay. So really what I want you to do now is to think about a change that you're bringing about in your organization. And ask yourself these questions, because if you can't answer these questions, my suggestion is do not start with the change process, because you're going to waste an inordinate amount of time. And so much time is wasted on change that isn't sustainable. So ask yourself this question: is the change really high quality? And if so, can you really move it beyond the few to the many in your organization? Can you guarantee the quality, the depth, the consistency, the fidelity of the implementation process? If you can't, you're going to waste valuable resources and time. And is there sufficient capability and capacity within your system to deliver the change? One of the things I do, working in a university, I go and watch young teachers teach. And I was in a maths lesson the other day, and this teacher was teaching equations. And at the end of the lesson, he turned to the children and he said, okay, he said, now do you understand equations more than you did at the start of the lesson? Absolute silence. So he was a bit embarrassed. He said, well, are you sure you don't understand equations even a little bit better? Absolute silence. And he asked for a 3rd time. And then one little girl put her hand up and she said, no, sir, but I am confused on a much higher plane. So if I've confused you this morning, I hope it's on a much higher plane. I think there are substantial benefits to the blueprint. I also think there are substantial challenges in implementing and making it a reality for classroom teachers. So, on that note, I made the mistake of saying at a conference, this is my website if you'd like to send any comments or any money. So let me be clear, send comments, okay? That would be great. And here are the email addresses if you'd like to follow up on any aspect that I've talked about. Thank you very much for listening and enjoy the rest of your conference. Thank you.